Donald Trump seems to have gotten into this habit now of holding these kind of impromptu press conferences from within the Oval Office when he's signing these executive orders, and he has indeed signed a couple of executive orders when it comes to imposing tariffs on metal imports into the United States, 25% on aluminium and 25% on steel imports into the United States, which echoes what he did in his first time. The numbers are slightly different, but he started by saying there would be no exemptions, but he was specifically asked about the phone call with Australia's Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. And I'll quote from him. He's described Anthony Albanese as a very fine man and pointed out that Australia has a surplus, or that they have a surplus with Australia, one of the very few. And he says it's because Australia buys a lot of aeroplanes. And he says that they would give some great consideration, something to consider regarding whether or not Australia would be exempt from these tariffs. So that does seem to be consistent with what we heard from Australia's Prime Minister earlier today after he had that conversation with the President of the United States. He said that they were going to consider Australia's request for an exemption, the argument being that America has a trade surplus with Australia, and Donald Trump has a quite simplistic view when it comes to trade interactions. He thinks that if America is selling more to another country than they are buying from that country, that's a good thing, and the reverse is a bad thing. So in the case of Australia and America, Australia buys more of America than America buys of Australia. So you would think that that would be seen positively by Donald Trump. And even though he had at one point said there'd be no exceptions, no exemptions, he said that they are considering the argument put forward by the Australian Prime Minister that we should be exempt from these tariffs. But Donald Trump says that these tariffs that he's imposing are about forcing companies in other countries to move their production from those other countries and to produce aluminium and steel in America. He says, therefore, once they move that production, there won't be any cost rise. This is all about moving the actual production. Now, many mainstream economists are very concerned by what these tariffs could mean for the global economy. They are seen as pushing prices up, the inflationary, but also that this will cause retaliation. And we already heard earlier from the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, who said that if these were imposed, as they now appear to have been, that the Germans, the EU, would have to retaliate to what Donald Trump is doing. And we also heard from the Mexican president, Claudia Sheinbaum, who said she would wait to see the details, but we know that they were also previously open to the idea of retaliation tariffs coming into play.
Carrington, the President also addressed his plans and also a deadline for Gaza.
Yeah, so Donald Trump was asked about Hamas suspending the agreement, the ceasefire agreement. He said if it was up to him, he would impose a deadline of midday on this Saturday for the release of all the hostages. He said the condition of the hostages who have been released so far suggests that they are being maltreated, and that he would say unless all hostages are released by midday on Saturday, all hell is going to break out. So strong language from the American president, but then he did subsequently say that it wasn't up to him to decide. It would be up to Israel to decide on those conditions. But it is language that similar language to what we heard from Donald Trump through the election campaign, that if all the hostages weren't released by the time he came, by the time he took power here in the United States, that all hell would break loose. And so perhaps, again, this is just a negotiation tactic, but this is concerning language. He was also asked about his plans to move the Palestinian population from the Gaza Strip. Again asked, he keeps saying that he would just create a much nicer place for them and they would want to leave, and was asked repeatedly what would happen if Palestinians did not want to leave their homes in Gaza. And he kind of pushed away that argument and said that they would want to because it would be nicer. He was asked then What about Palestinians in the West Bank, the other component of the occupied Palestinian territories? And he said he had no plans for any such population move from the West Bank.
Our North America correspondent Carrington Clark in Washington, thank you. And just to let you know, we are standing by to go to a news conference with the opposition leader Peter Dutton here in Australia. He'll be responding to any tariffs or exemptions that Australia might be getting to these, and we'll bring you that live when it comes to hand. Now, let's return to the subject of tariffs. Business editor Michael Yander is with me in the studio. Now, Michael, we don't know if Australia's going to get an exemption or not at this point. How are markets reacting to this then?
Look, not too hard at the moment, and the best barometer is BlueScope Steel, which is a listed company that is potentially subject to some of these tariffs for its steel exports to the US, which are less than 10% of the company's Australian output, but most of its operations are in the US, and so its share price is up, or when I came into the studio, 1.5% in early trade again, as investors see the positives for its US operations outweighing any negatives for its Port Kembla operation in New South Wales.
Depending on how this goes, with an exemption or not, what would be the direct impacts for Australia?
Look, marginal impact for BlueScope. Clearly the share market thinks overall the company won't suffer too much damage. Obviously its local operation is more likely to be affected, but it does have other markets for those products in Southeast Asia, so presumably would shift, if its exports to the US from Australia were subject to the tariff, would try and shift sales. That could be one of the flow-on impacts on other companies like GFG Alliance in Whyalla, where they might face increased import competition from, say, South Korea, Canada, Brazil, other countries dumping steel products around the world because they can't sell them competitively into the US. The aluminium sector is the big one too. That actually exports about 10% of the entire output to the US from Australia. It's not clear exactly which companies will be affected and to what extent. The Aluminium Council says there's 21,000 jobs connected to the industry in Australia, many of, the vast bulk of them in regional areas. So that's obviously a key concern and one of the reasons why the government clearly has been pushing hard to try and get a carve-out for Australia. And we're getting those mixed messages from Donald Trump. No exceptions, but maybe an exception for Australia. We'll see what happens.
Yes, that's still up in the air for Australia, but other countries, they won't be getting an exemption. This will go ahead. What are the indirect impacts that we could see here in Australia of what will then happen?
Well, the big concern would be the iron ore market. That's a far bigger export for Australia. Steel and aluminium, we're talking combined exports to the US of about $1 billion per annum, possibly less. Iron ore is Australia's biggest export, and coking coal, which goes into steel production, is also a massive export. Now, the worry there is that if South Korea, for instance, can't sell its steel products competitively into the US, maybe it cuts back production, and that affects iron ore demand from countries like that. But the good news for Australia, most of our iron ore goes to China, which is the world's largest steel producer by far. And China, after the previous round of Trump tariffs, exports very little steel to the United States. It exports elsewhere around the world. And with commodity producers, if one country doesn't, reduces its demand for iron ore because of these tariffs, but then say US producers ramp up production domestically to make up for those lost imports, well, guess what? They still need just as much iron ore and coking coal to make the steel. So from a commodity point of view, it shouldn't have too much effect. And we kind of saw that with China's tariffs on things like barley, when they imposed those. True commodities can just shift to another market.
Now, we saw Trump there again address reciprocal tariffs. He says he'll have more to say on that, maybe an announcement or announcements later in the week. What are they, and what industries are we looking at that could be most affected by this?
Well, he did reference cars, was definitely one that he talked about. The advantage for Australia here is that we unilaterally dropped most of our tariffs, and if they're not zero, they're certainly very low for most products. And that's been something that's started under the Whitlam government all the way back in the 70s, continued through the Hawke and Keating governments, the Howard government. Australia really has a very open trading relationship because as a major commodity exporter, it's in our interests, and for our consumers, it's in their interests to have tariff-free imports of consumer goods, makes everything cheaper. And this is what US consumers are about to confront, where suddenly all these products they were getting cheaply from Southeast Asia, from China, might become a lot more expensive from Canada, from Mexico. So, you know, I think from an Australian point of view, retaliatory tariffs from the US, particularly given we have a free trade agreement with the US, are unlikely to have much impact.
And I mean, it's all about the deal with Donald Trump. So explain again to our audiences the position that Australia finds ourselves in with this under consideration, an exemption, due to the US trade surplus with Australia and, as you say, these free trade agreements. What puts us in a better stead for that?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because if no one had asked specifically about Australia, then we would have just had Donald Trump's initial statement that there's no exceptions, all countries will be covered. So it would create, you'd think, a bit of tension internationally if Australia was the only country to get a carve-out from this. Because remember, a lot of the countries subject to these tariffs are very strong US allies. Look at Japan and South Korea, two major allies in the Asian area, and US troops, you know, historically and still stationed in great numbers in South Korea as part of that military alliance and protection against North Korea. And to slap, you know, tariffs on that country, one of its major exports, steel, and then if they go down the road of higher tariffs on cars or other manufactured goods, and that's going to create incredible tension and the potential for retaliation as well. So, I mean, it's going to be an interesting time, not only from an economic point of view, and as Carrington said, most economists would agree that in the end, everyone's a loser from a trade war. No one wins from tariffs, particularly consumers, but it will create geopolitical tensions as well.